Welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England.
Welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England. Ben is the founder of FDAImports.com and a former FDA regulatory counsel who helps companies worldwide navigate the complex intersection of FDA oversight and international trade. I'm Lisa Mosby, and today we're talking about where FDA compliance responsibilities often break down between importers and customs brokers and why that misunderstanding causes real problems at the border. Welcome back, Ben.
Hi, great to see you. Thanks so much.
You know, Ben, many importers assume their customs broker is handling FDA compliance as part of the entry process. Where does that assumption usually go wrong?
Yeah, really good question. Customs brokers are licensed to communicate to Customs and Border Protection and other agencies on behalf of importers. So importers are the people that are buying and bringing the product into the United States. They're the ones that are commercially responsible. Usually they're responsible for paying duties. Not always. Sometimes the foreign supplier might be required to pay duties. But that's contractual. The decision is made between the two parties. But usually the importer is paying the duties, and the importer is also responsible for regulatory compliance of the product. So if it's a drug, for instance, or a medical device, then the approval requirements, the importer is going to have to ensure that those approvals have been met, right? Have been obtained. If it's a medical device, it has a 510K or pre-market approval. If it's a drug, then it has either a generic drug approval, an abbreviated new drug approval, or an NDA for an innovator drug. So the importer is responsible for the compliance and always responsible. And it doesn't matter that the customs broker is sort of in between. The customs broker is an agent of the importer when it comes to communicating with the government. So all of the critical declarations that are being made when the goods arrive, the harmonized tariff schedule, the classification, what is the thing? How is it treated with respect to duty? How is it treated with respect to quotas? There are quotas for a lot of products where you're only allowed to bring only so much material is allowed to come into the country because the U.S. government protects domestic industry. Whether or not the product is subject to any other government agency like the FDA or USDA or DEA or EPA, et cetera. Right? So the broker is transmitting all that information to customs. And the broker's licensed to do so. In fact, they take an exam. And customs brokers are super smart people. I mean, these people, the customs brokerage exam, I'm told, has a higher fail rate than the bar exams do. Right? It's actually a very, very complicated exam. And so customs brokers are licensed to do this, and they are professionals. Now, they're professionals primarily in the customs space, unless they have done a lot of entries and shipments that are regulated by the FDA. Okay, so I can't sort of it's hard to say much more other than those customs brokers that have never really handled an FDA entry are going to have problems with respect to the data that's required. The importer is required to make sure the data is accurate and that it's transmitted. If the broker messes up the entry, the importer is going to be responsible because the broker is nothing more than an agent of the importer. So the gap will usually be with a customs broker that has never filed the type of entry that they're filing. Some issues the broker always handles, and so you don't usually have that problem. The broker usually knows how to do it. But that's where you sort of see the breakdown is with a broker that has never done a drug entry, never done a medical device entry, or done a food or cosmetic entry, and so they're going to struggle. It doesn't mean they can't get it. It just means that the importer is going to have to provide a lot more information to make sure they get it right.
So, Ben, are there some FDA-related issues that fall outside of a broker's role, even though importers expect them to cover it?
So I guess yes. Then that comes down to the relationship the importer has with the broker. For instance, very, very large couriers, right, who deliver things to your house that you bought on the internet, right? I'm trying not to use any names, right? But they show up at your door in a package, right? But they came through the border. You were the importer because you bought it from a foreign company that exported it to you and used a common courier to do so. The common courier usually has an in-house customs broker that made declaration of those goods. And if you have to pay duty, if anybody had this problem, you may have had these problems in the, in 2025, early 2026 with the IEEPA tariffs, where everything was being tariffed, extra duties on everything. So the goods would arrive, and then you get a bill later from the courier for the duties that you had to pay and didn't know. Right? And so that's not in the purchase price. I paid $25 for something. If I got a 25% duty, well, do the math. 25 times 0.25. The broker is going to go ahead and pay that if it's a major big courier. If it's not, the broker's not going to pay that. And it might be that the cargo just sits and sits because the importer hasn't taken the steps it needs to take in order to properly import the goods, or they failed to give the information that the broker needs to file the entry. The broker can't just make data up. So there can be definitely gaps in communication. That usually is failure to have a conversation before the goods arrive with the customs broker explaining what's coming. And the broker, a lot of times, will tell you pretty quickly whether or not they have done it before, and ask you if you've done it, because then they're going to get some hints from you as to what documents and data they're going to need. Failure to have the adequate, proper approvals, that's on the importer and the foreign manufacturer, not the broker. Giving the information to the broker so that information can go to customs, that's on the importer. If the importer gave it to customs or to the broker has to give it to customs. That's on the broker. Right? The broker's job is just declare what you said and what it is. That's all their job is. Not comply with any of those things, with the actual substantive requirements.
How does this gap show up at the border? Like, what kinds of problems surface when the FDA compliance hasn't been addressed upstream?
Well, if the compliance substantively hasn't been addressed, right? Like the foreign supplier has failed to actually comply with the law before they shipped, then the result is going to be many times that there's going to be a missing data element in the entry. In the entry, I'm talking about the transmission. So the entry is kind of like your tax return with the IRS. It's the thing you submit, right? It's the form with all that data. Well, the entry is the thing you submit that has all the information about the stuff that's coming in. So the entry has to have a bunch of data. If an approval is required, let's say it's a canned food, and certain canned foods require certain pre-approvals in the processing, or it's a drug or a medical device that requires some sort of approval. Well, that means that a number is going to be issued, and those numbers are sitting in FDA's database, so the FDA will cross-reference those numbers when those numbers are received. Well, that has to come in the entry. If the number doesn't exist, right, or a wrong number is used, right, a number that belongs to a different manufacturer is used, the system's going to obviously detect that. And so if it turns out that the number like just literally doesn't exist because the manufacturer hasn't taken the steps to get the approval, then those goods are not coming in because they're not approved. If it turns out that the number does exist, but it either wasn't submitted or the wrong one was submitted, then it's going to get stopped, and the importer is going to have the opportunity to cure that problem by providing the right information or providing the initial information that was not provided initially. So usually that can be fixed as long as the problem was just simply a failure to provide the data. And then the next thing is you want to go back to talk to your customs broker and make sure that they're sort of like trained. The customs broker a lot of times is going to say, they're going to ask you a bunch of questions. What's the product? What are the requirements? What are the affirmations of compliance codes, right? If you think about an affirmation of compliance, I'm going to affirm that my goods comply with the law. And there's a code for that. That code is in the FDA system. It dictates what you're supposed to put in there. And so your affirmation of compliance, and the broker is going to want the codes because that's what they're going to transmit. The brokers that are used to doing FDA entries are also used to talking to FDA, and that's good, unless they get in over their heads, and then it's not good, right? It's sometimes true. In fact, it's true more than people probably realize, where the question or the problem is a little more complex than just the affirmation of compliance code or whether or not there is an approval or not, right? The government might have like a more nuanced question. And under those circumstances, you're going to want to go look for help and not rely on the broker to have that conversation with the government.
Ben, there's a lot of moving parties in this. In situations where a broker submits information provided by an importer or a supplier, who ultimately bears the risk if the information turns out to be incomplete or inaccurate?
I would say it's going to be shared, depending upon the problem. It's going to be shared between the manufacturer and the importer. The importer is the one primarily held responsible for compliance with the goods when it comes in. And that's all compliance issues, right? If it turns out that the product is adulterated, let's say it was manufactured out of compliance with good manufacturing practices that are required by FDA for a drug facility, right? Well, that sounds like it's a drug facility's obligation. Well, it is. However, the importer needs to know whether or not there's a problem in that facility, and particularly if FDA knows of a problem, and there's ways to find that out. But because when those goods arrive, if they're adulterated because of that kind of a problem, the importer is the one who's not getting the goods, right? I mean, they're the ones that are not going to successfully import, and so the importer is going to bear that burden. So the importer is always responsible for the goods and the compliance. However, the manufacturer is also responsible, right? If it has to do with a registration issue or some kind of a listing or a permitting issue, that's easy. The manufacturer just fixes it. They just have to bring themselves into compliance so that the importer isn't held responsible at the border. Now, this seems harsh to the importer. The law, however, is written in a way that it recognizes that the importer is a little bit out of control with respect to what's happening in the foreign facility, right? I mean, unless the importer has somebody in the plant all day long, they have no way to know, nobody else has any way to know whether the facility is actually operating the way it should. You can always check the systems when it comes to the data, like a code, except sometimes the codes are not visible to the public. They're only visible to the person who submitted them to the government, which is the foreign supplier. So the importer might not be able to check whether the code is actually in the system. So they're trusting the foreign manufacturer, and it gets here. And then the importer is held responsible. And it seems, well, that's not fair. Well, maybe. I will say that's the risk of being in business as an importer. The other thing that I would say is that it turns out that the remedy, right, the regulatory remedy is not that sort of like damaging. It's not that difficult for the importer. The options are export the goods back, right, or destroy them. Well, destroy them sounds bad. In fact, when you read the law, it says that if the goods are subject to refusal by the FDA, the goods will be destroyed unless exported in 90 days, right? So that unless is obviously what everybody takes. They all go to the export. Unless, I mean, it could be that the goods aren't sort of like worth it. It could be it costs too much to export the goods back. It's actually cheaper to destroy them, put them in the dump. You know, like snow peas coming out of Guatemala that has some pesticide problem. You know, at a buck a box, you probably can't ship them back without like eating more in costs and shipping costs than the value of the goods. So you just dump them and then you take your credit from the supplier the next time. But so even though the importer is going to be held responsible and the importer doesn't really have control over what's happening in the facility because they're not in the facility, the remedy is not too harsh because they can export the goods. They can commercially, they can sort of like make themselves right with the foreign supplier. So who's responsible? Really, both parties for different pieces of it, but the importer is always going to be held responsible. The broker, on the other hand, unless the broker makes a mistake, then the broker is not going to be responsible. The broker is going to have what's called errors and omissions insurance, right? So that insures the broker against errors and omissions that they may make during an entry. And whenever you read the contracts, I guarantee it's going to say this because they all say this. The broker is going to say, our liability is limited to the cost that you paid us in order to file the entry, right? So they're going to be, I pay the broker $150 to file an entry. They make a mistake that cost me $50,000. I'm going to go to the broker and say, you owe me the 50 grand. They'll say, no, look at the contract. I owe you $150, right? And by the way, anything really bad, my errors and omissions insurance is going to cover, but it's not going to cover that because the contract covers that. So I'm going to eat that. So I better know that the goods that are coming in are the right ones, and I better make sure my broker knows what they're doing, and I better make sure I give the broker the right information. I have to control that relationship and not let the broker control it. The other thing is the broker, it's like your accountant with the IRS, right? The accountant is not taking the hit if you give them bad information and you file a false tax return, right? The accountant's not the one taking the hit, you are. And it's a similar thing. If you give the wrong information to the broker's not going to take that hit, you are. So you've got to make sure that you give the broker the right information. You've got to know what the broker needs. And that's sometimes an education for you. You got to spend time. You can ask the broker, but I wouldn't rely on that from the broker unless the broker does a lot of shipments that are regulated by the FDA. You got to check it yourself.
So many moving parts. Ben, where I want to wrap this up today is last question. For companies importing FDA regulated goods regularly, how should responsibilities be clearly divided so FDA compliance is consistently addressed and we open lines of communication between all these parties?
Basically, international commerce and the movement of cargo across international borders is complicated, and a lot of things can go wrong. We didn't talk about freight forwarders. We didn't talk about exporters that are not the manufacturers, shipping agents. There's all sorts of carrier, like the carrier, right? It comes across in a vessel in some container ship. Well, the container, the operator of the ship is a party to the transaction, the transit of the goods. So there's many, many, many more people. All of those risks have to be handled by contract. Now, the contract that exists between the importer and the foreign supplier is probably the weakest contract. It's probably the weakest one in the link. And the reason is because the foreign supplier doesn't want to lock themselves into obligations, and the importer is afraid to push too hard because the manufacturer will sell to somebody else and won't have those requirements. Like, there's lots of reasons why they try not to bind themselves. You got to do it in the contracts. The broker is not going to be your broker without a contract, because the broker has to have a power of attorney. So the broker's not an attorney, but they are an attorney in fact. They're not an attorney at law. I'm an attorney at law, right? I'm licensed to practice law. Brokers are not. Brokers are licensed to tell the government information about your entry or my entry, and so in a sense, accountants are the same kind of thing. They're basically attorneys in fact, and they have to have a power of attorney to make those declarations. So my sense is, so ordinarily the way to manage that is almost always going to be in the contracts. The broker contract is going to be written by an association, and all the brokers contracts are going to look the same. You're not going to be able to do much negotiation with that one. So you got to do it with your foreign supplier.
There's so many moving parts. People need you, and I can see why.
Yeah, it can be complicated, and it is important to know your roles, not take on the responsibility of somebody else. Know your responsibilities and fulfill those responsibilities. And you might need help with that, so let us know.
And folks, that's it for today's episode of FDA Imports Cross-Border Compliance. If your company is relying on assumptions about who handles FDA compliance, or you're dealing with a detention tied to missing or incorrect information, visit FDAImports.com to connect with Ben and his team. And if this episode was helpful, be sure to like, leave a review, and subscribe to the show so that you don't miss the next one. We'll see you there.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.